I have one very important question to ask. Why on earth is Megalosaurus not a household name? Why isn't it a very well-known name to the public? Like, why doesn't it have the same status as some other types of dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus or Allosaurus or Triceratops or Iguanodon or any of those fellas? Because by all accounts, it should. It was the first ever officially named dinosaur, which means it was the first dinosaur to officially be recognized through science. 200 years ago, back in 1824, actually 201 years ago. It's just weird to me that it doesn't have the same celebrity status as some other, very famous dinosaurs. Actually, a lot of that reason might be because we have like no fossils of it. Like, it's a very fragmentary dinosaur. Despite the fact that we've known it for centuries now, we still have very little in the way of fossils. Even Iguanodon, which is the second dinosaur to ever be named, even we've found way more fossils of it later. So Megalosaurus is kind of in an unfortunate spot. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the many depictions of Megalosaurus. It was a theropod, a megalosaurid, if you could believe it, that lived in the Middle Jurassic of what is now Europe. It was likely one of the top predators in its given area, and again, it's a very underrated dinosaur. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I want to start off with some of the earlier reconstructions. Because Megalosaurus is old, in the fact that we've known about it for a long time, it has some very, very dated reconstructions that are very cool to look at. A lot of which are very lizard-like in their appearance, which makes sense given the context of their description. At the time when Megalosaurus was discovered, it was thought to be a giant lizard, or at the very least, a giant lizard-like reptile, which is why it was given the name Megalosaurus, which translates to great lizard. And so a lot of earlier reconstructions really kind of like grabbed onto that and just didn't let go. And that's even reflected in the Crystal Palace reconstructions, which are probably some of the most famous examples of early dinosaur reconstructions. In fact, the Crystal Palace reconstructions, I'd say, are very important because they helped the public get interested in dinosaurs, in long extinct animals, because obviously art for these extinct animals was done like years before they ever made statues of them. But the statues put them on display for everybody to see. You could walk around, take a stroll, and just check them out. And people loved it, And obviously, it's very different from our modern day reconstructions. You have a giant quadrupedal alligator lizard creature going on here, with an elongated snout filled with all kinds of teeth and a huge bulky body with a tail that is also dragging. Very, very outdated by today's standards, but all things considered, they did pretty good with the material that they had. Obviously, dinosaurs were not that well known at the time, so trying to fill in the gaps of animals you've literally never seen before, nor have you found any like direct evidence for before, it was certainly a tall task, and they did pretty good with the materials that they had. Again, it's just different from what we now know of them. And let me just set the standard real quick. We don't really have a good idea of what Megalosaurus looked like. As I said, it's a very fragmentary dinosaur. So in order to get a good idea of what its overall anatomy looked like, you would have to look at some of its close relatives, other megalosaurids like Torvosaurus. Take this PNSO Megalosaurus figure, for example. A lot of the gaps are filled in by other megalosaurids like Torvosaurus. You can definitely see that in the skull, as the skull is a lot more squared, which is something that Torvosaurus does have. That's simply just something known as phylogenetic bracketing. You have to try to fill in the gaps of some animals by taking a look at some of their close relatives. In this case, the way that the skull is shaped is based off of that. So I guess this is what we're going to be looking for when going into the rest of this video. But then we'll go ahead and move on to some of our more modern depictions, such as when dinosaurs ruled the earth. So we're still not quite in theropod territory. These fellows are basically like giant lizards with a longer neck, a very like carnosaur or lizard-like skull dragging its tail, and of course it's quadrupedal. As we know, Megalosaurus is a theropod dinosaur, which means that it was a bipedal dinosaur, just like every single bird. All birds are bipedal. But it also does have like some spikes on its head, and it's just, overall, it's just very lizard-like in its appearance, which is very interesting for a portrayal like this, because this was released in 1970, and obviously we were way past the giant lizards idea. That was most likely a stylized choice for the movie. So it's an interesting depiction. There's also Earl St. Clair from the series known as Dinosaurs. I love the fact that he's the main character and that he's a Megalosaurus, because that just makes sense. It's one of the original dinosaurs, basically. Make them some of the main characters. I like his appearance. He's not paleo accurate, nor is that what they were going for. These fellows, obviously, they're meant to be stylized and they're meant to be anthropomorphized in a huge way. This guy does definitely look like a like what you would expect a human dinosaur hybrid to look like. He also has like a bunch of knobs on his head and stuff. So it's like there's really nothing that kind of compares him accurately to Megalosaurus. It's just a fun stylized design. I just want to say that I love the fact that he's the main character and he is Megalosaurus. That is what I'm talking about right there. Dinosaurs with Walter Cronkite has a good one, as in it's a lot closer to our modern understanding of the animal. The skull shape is not quite like Torvosaurus shaped, but at least it's better than some of like the lizard depictions that we've been seeing, or at least it's closer to some of those depictions. The rest of the body is a typical theropod body, which that certainly does check out, but the arms are kind of facing downward, palms facing downward, which is a, that's an outdated idea. They couldn't do that. They would have to break their wrists to do that, but it's a good practical effect and it kind of sets the standard going forward. We're getting closer. We make a huge jump after that to Dinosaur King. And this one, yeah, it looks good. It has a huge, well, it's huge for one thing. Megalosaurus, it was a big theropod, but it wasn't quite this big. Megalosaurus had a length of around 6 meters or 20 feet and was a little bit closer to being, smaller than this overall. I like the colors of it though, and the skull shape is something that stands out a lot to me. It is a lot more squared and closer to Torvosaurus than previous iterations that we've seen. Therefore, it's a lot closer to a lot of our modern day reconstructions of the animal. So I do quite like it. I think that this is a very good, huge step in that correct direction. There's also Dinosaur Train. There's not a lot about this one that really screams Megalosaurus. Like in a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to the Tyrannosaurus design in the same show, which I wouldn't really be surprised if that was the case. Like I wouldn't be surprised if this was the Tyrannosaurus model, just tweaked a little bit to look a little bit different. However, it does have like these pronounced crests, which is very different from the Tyrannosaurus model, and the coloration is obviously very different. But as per usual, it's Dinosaur Train. It is a stylized children's show, so we're not going to see 100% accuracy in it. C-Rex has a quick little appearance of Megalosaurus, seen briefly right here and also mentioned right here, where you also get to learn what its name means. It's got basically like a typical theropod build, and there's really nothing about it that stands out. Wrists are breaking, and it's probably a bit shrink-wrapped in the skull and probably the rest of the body. The skull shape does seem to be a little bit squared, though, which is a bit more modern. We also have Raptor Ranch that has this fella right here, and I quite like it as just like a type of theropod design, I suppose. Its snout is a bit squared, but it's covered in all these little bits, all these sharp bits going all over the place, all these spikes covering its snout and its head and its neck. It's got really cool like blue coloration and some kind of seems like there's some extra patterns in there as well. I really like the way the scales kind of sit where its teeth are. They're kind of like protruding out, makes it look like it almost has lips. And I like the texturing of the scales too. I think that's a very nice detail. So that's a fine one. I quite like it. Then we finally get to Dinosaur Britain, which is probably the best one that we've seen so far in terms of its overall skeletal anatomy, again, compared to other megalosaurids, because we don't have much of Megalosaurus. Also, a little fun fact, did you know that there was like once a point in time when they were naming like over 50 species of Megalosaurus? The reason why that happened is because we were, dinosaurs were still new. So when they found other theropods that were similar to Megalosaurus, they just looped it into the same genus. Obviously now we know that's not the case, and most of those are now no longer Megalosaurus species. In fact, there's only one species of Megalosaurus that is officially identified, that being Megalosaurus bucklandi. And of course, it's the one that's incredibly fragmentary. I also know that there's been like some questions about its validity, but I don't really know where we stand on that. I know that currently it is still like valid as its own species, but who knows what the future would hold with that. Anyway, back to Dinosaur Britain. Colors look really cool in this one. Nice black stripes with some orange, like a base coloration of orange. Skull shape is very megalosaurid, and the arms look good despite the fact that they are breaking. It also does have like a lot of beef on it. Like it's got a lot of meat on its bones. I think that it's portrayed quite well. I really like this one. This one is certainly one of my favorites. Okay, and then we definitely have to talk about Dinosauria Volume 2, Terrible Lizards, which is something that I've already talked about quite a bit. We get a few different Megalosaurus portrayals in this. Obviously, we get the Crystal Palace Megalosaurus, which, I've already talked about that. It's very different from our modern understanding. Then we get a Carnosaur-inspired Megalosaurus, which is something that I don't think we ever got throughout the history of dinosaurs in cinema. At least I couldn't find anything. The Carnosaur, it's basically like, you can look at it and you could call it practically any type of dinosaur. So it's like you could technically call this an Allosaurus or a T-Rex because they all pretty much look the same at the time. But here it's depicted as a Megalosaurus, which is just very cool. And then you get the sort of 90s to early 2000s reconstructions that are very thin, very shrink wrapped with very exposed teeth. But the skull shape is a lot more in line to our modern reconstructions. Then you get to the modern day where obviously it just keeps the same colors, but it has like oral tissue, it has more meat on its bones, and it also has like sparse amounts of feathers, which I think is really cool. The babies are also completely covered in fluff, and they look great as well. Dead Sound just killed it with this one. I've said that many times. This is one of my favorite like dinosaur short films out there. It's so cool. And just, you know, especially the fact that you're giving some like Megalosaurus some love, which is just awesome. But then we'll go ahead and go to the Jurassic franchise with some of the video games like Jurassic Park 3 Park Builder. You can't really see much of it, but it does seem like the skull is a little bit more rounded, not very megalosaurid in shape, and obviously this fella is pretty shrink wrapped. You can also see it in Jurassic World the game, where it's got a lot of bulk to it, but the skull, again, is a lot more rounded and not nearly as squared as most modern day reconstructions. I think it also has 2 fingers, which is very common for most theropods in this game because of the fact that they're like all rigged to the same model, so they all kind of like blend together. Megalosaurus, you likely had 3 fingers and not 2. Jurassic World Alive has one that kind of looks like their Metriacanthosaur, like the Jurassic franchise's Metriacanthosaurus. But that aside, this looks really good. Well, like I like the shape of the skull, and I like the way that the rest of the body looks. I also really do like the patterns and colors that this fella has. Then we have Jurassic World Evolution 2. I love the fact that these guys are in the game. I think that is something that is very much appreciated in a world that is lacking Megalosaurus. It is certainly an interesting take. It looks like the snout is significantly reduced compared to other portrayals that we've seen. The arms seem to be facing the correct way, and the whole body seems pretty fine. It seems like a pretty typical theropod body plan. And it also does have like some spikes or some osteoderms back there and a very pronounced crest. Most of what they're like representing here is, of course, skull material that has not been found. So they probably did take that chance to creatively make it look a little bit different. Like, look how pronounced those eyebrows are. That's crazy. Yeah, you know, it's a fair take. It's a decent take, but obviously, you know, most other modern reconstructions, as I've said millions of times by now, are based off of Torvosaurus. Like, that's mostly the route that they take, or other such megalosaurids. But these guys aren't terrible. You know, you can see a little bit of like retro in them, which I think is pretty cool and very fitting for a dinosaur like Megalosaurus. So there's some really good things to like about it. Rawr. And there we have it. Those are the majority of the depictions that I was able to find. Like I said, there's really not a lot out there, which I think is really quite unfortunate for a dinosaur that is so like important for our history of paleontology and our history of our understanding of dinosaurs as a whole. And don't even get me started about Hylaeosaurus, a dinosaur that nobody knows about. It's except for Dead Sound. Dead Sound does. But regardless, there are some fun designs here. Like, there were some really cool depictions of this animal that I thought were quite fun. Some of them were way more off to our modern understanding than others, but all in all, it's just really cool to see Megalosaurus anywhere, especially for an animal that was named first in a whole clade. But that's pretty much all I have for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did and you like dinosaur related content, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you on board. Also, if you want to help support me and the channel, I do have a Patreon and a channel membership. The links for those are down below. You get access to some really cool perks, and I really do appreciate each and every one of you who does support me on there. But that's all I have for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have an awesome day.